So hello and welcome to the Warburg Institute's virtual lecture room once again, and this special meeting of the Director's Seminar. I'm Bill Sherman, and it's both a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Professor Ullrich Langer to give a talk that will actually do double duty as both a Director's Seminar and as the keynote lecture for a conference this coming Friday on reading the virtues, literary culture, and the good life in Europe, 1450 to 1750. I don't know why, but that title makes me happy. So it's already done some good work in the world. It's a wonderful topic, but also a nice title. So I'm actually going to hand over to my colleague, Sara Miglietti, who's the co-organizer of the conference. And she's best placed to introduce both today's talk and the larger program of which it's a part. So Sara, over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see everybody here. Great thanks to Ullrich, first of all, for agreeing to this slightly weird format where we're having the keynote 3 days before the actual conference, but we were keen to have the program in one afternoon on Friday. So I'm going to put the details of the conference in the chat later if anyone who's here hasn't yet registered for that or hasn't heard of it yet. But I see my co-organizer here, Matthias Roig. Hi, Matthias, it's great to see you. And some of the speakers and respondents who will participate also in the conference on Friday. So I don't want to take any time from Ullrich's keynote, so I will just introduce him and then we're going to hear from him and have a Q&A at the end. So Ullrich is Villa's Distinguished Achievement Professor Emeritus in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he's the perfect keynote speaker for this conference. Many of you will be familiar with his book, I think 1994 book on perfect friendship, which was precisely on literary culture and ethics in the Renaissance. But of course, he's also the author of many other publications, including the companion to Montaigne, Penser les formes du plaisir littéraire à la Renaissance, Lyric in the Renaissance from Petrarch to Montaigne, and he's now working on a book project called Lyric Humanity, which is an analysis of selected examples of lyric and lyric episodes in narrative from Virgil to the contemporary period, which solicit certain human abilities. He's also been visiting professors at many universities, Tübingen, Chicago, Nantes, Tours. We are going to hear, I actually don't have the title of your talk here, I'm so sorry, but it was Praise, Virtue, and the Court, I think it was the title.
Fiction of the Court.
Perfect. I'll leave the floor to you, and you should be able to share your screen with us when you're ready. So over to you, Ullrich.
Is that all right? Can everyone see the screen well?
Looks good.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Sarah and Bill and John, for making this possible. And I really look forward to the workshop on Friday. So I will take about 40 to 45 minutes, no more than 45 minutes in this talk. And I will start with some brief remarks about the connection between literary representation and the determination of virtue. So how does literature allow you to determine virtue? I will go on to compare passages from 3 semi-fictional renderings of courts spanning the mid-15th century to the second half of the 17th century, namely Antoine de la Salle's Jehan de Saintré, finished in early 1456, Castiglione's Libro del Cortegiano from 1528, and Mme de Lafayette's La Princesse de Clèves from 1678. I will end up, if I have time, with another comparison, this one more dramatic. It involves the scene from the latter novel, The Princesse de Clèves, in which Mme de Clèves justifies to M de Nemours, those are the 2 protagonists, her unwillingness to marry him. And then the conclusion of a novella by Albert Camus entitled La femme adultère, in which the protagonist Janine returns to her hotel room and to her husband Marcel, whom she does not love. So we have a huge span of time here, from the late Middle Ages to some more or less contemporary texts. Letters and virtue enjoy a natural structural connection in the early modern period, and I'm interested in that portion of letters involving rhetorical composition and composition of fiction. I'm trying to change the screen.
Ullrich, can you see the little arrows at the bottom left of your screen?
Oh, okay, yes. There we go, thank you. So the compositional elements of a fiction, and usually its contents, convey the determination and inculcation of virtue. But how is that? Let us look at virtue first. Virtue is not an abstract rule, a principle, or an application of a concept. It is a deliberate, habitual practice developed over time. This practice is guided by rational deliberation, but only partly, and is guided just as importantly by the imitation of those who already are virtuous. How do we determine who is virtuous? By discerning who is held to be virtuous by the prudent men. But how do we know that a person is held to be virtuous or that certain actions are perceived to be virtuous? Because the person and his or her actions are the object of praise. When we are virtuous ourselves, our actions become praiseworthy and worthy of imitation. An action that is virtuous is always deserving of praise and deserving of imitation by others. Moral writing available to the early modern period involved the repartition of human behavior into ethical categories, all of which were accompanied by examples of actions that were relevant to that category and praiseworthy. When Valerius Maximus writes of fortitude, he gives but a summary definition of it. The value of his compendium is the wealth of examples of behavior that exemplify fortitude. When virtue ethics and the rhetoric of praise consider the human being as a subject, what is considered is the person, not the individual. The person is made up of various kinds of attributes, of which the praiseworthy ones are accessible to others. That is, they can be explained to others and understood by others through rational discourse, and the persons possessing them are comparable to other persons possessing those attributes. A person is not praised because she is unique, because she exemplifies an attribute that is present among others, but because she exemplifies an attribute that is present among others, and she is better or worse than others in manifesting that attribute. In this sense, what is important about the person is what is shared with others, or comparable to others, or at least explainable to others. A radically individual human being is not really praiseworthy in this sense, if what is most important about the person is her uniqueness. Rhetoric involves a similar circle of imitation and praise as the determination of virtue. Learning to be a good orator or a good courtier involves imitating those who already are praised as being a good orator or a good courtier. You do not imitate someone who is not good, and you find out who is good by noticing who has been praised. If virtue ethics and rhetoric are analogously bound to a circle of imitation and praise, so is what we now call literature, and what the early modern period would call fiction or poetry. Poetry is thought above all to involve epideictic rhetoric, representation of persons, actions, or circumstances, in some sense involves praising them or blaming them, which is sort of the reverse of the coin. You represent that which is worthy of being remembered, which naturally means that which is worthy of being praised. Aristotle famously attributes to mimesis an inherent pleasure, just as on his account, the free exercise of virtue either is a form of pleasure or is accompanied by an inherent pleasure. This anti-Platonic recuperation of representation in all its forms underlies the early modern structural link between virtue, epideictic rhetoric, and the letters in their mimetic function. Nowhere is this better illustrated, I contend, than in the euphoric representations of the court. We tend to think of court life as an insistent subject of satire and criticism, from Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini to Alain Chartier to Antonio de Guevara and so many others. But the humanist circle of the letters and the arts and the virtues is represented in many courts, and I would like to take some time to look at 3 examples of how literary representation nourishes the determination of virtue in the sense that I've outlined. Antoine de La Salle is the least known of my examples. He served the house of Anjou, René, Louis, and Jean, and the house of Luxembourg in various ways, and composed moral and historical compilations, as well as a roman de chevalerie, a mostly fictional account of the career of Jean de Saintré, a knight at the court of Jean le Bon and Bonne de Bohème in the mid-14th century. So he's looking back sort of nostalgically at a prior court. So this is the opening paragraph, and I will read the French and then come back to the complete text afterwards, highlighting certain words. So you will have more than one chance to look at this. And this is the very beginning of the novel. Au temps du roi Jean de France, fils aîné du roi Philippe de Valois, était en sa cour le seigneur de Pouilly en Touraine, qui en son hôtel avait un très débonnaire et gracieux jouvencel nommé Jean, et aîné fils au seigneur de Saintré, aussi en Touraine, lequel jouvencel, de par sa débonnaireté, vint en grâce au roi, et tellement qu'il le voulut avoir, et car il était encore bien jeune, le ordonna être son page, seulement après lui chevaucher, et le surplus servir en salle, comme ses autres pages enfants d'honneur. Lequel Jean de Saintré, sur tous les autres pages, enfants d'honneur, servait à chacun à table, çà et là, très diligemment, et assez plus que nul des autres, et spécialement des dames, et en tous les plaisirs et services qu'elle lui commandait à son pouvoir. Du surplus, selon son âge de 13 ans, était très habile et hardi Valton, fut pour chevaucher un bien rigoureux coursier, fut à chanter ou à danser, à jouer, à la paume, à courir, à saillir, à tous autres essais et bas qu'il voit aux hommes faire, et à tout ce volet joyeusement employé, combien que sa personne fut toujours large et menue, mais son cœur était entre les autres tout fer et acier, par lesquels habileté, douceur, courtoisie et de bonneté étaient si très aimés et loués du roi, de la reine, des seigneurs, des femmes et des dames et de tous, tant que chacun disait et jugeait que vraiment il serait bien un des renommés gentilshommes de France s'il vivait. Et vraiment ainsi fut-il, car à son trépassement de ce monde, il fut tenu des chevaliers le plus vaillants, ainsi que d'une partie de ces faits, si après l'histoire fera mention. So I'm going back to the entire paragraph with some highlighted words. The novel and the term is somewhat anachronistic, begins with a success story. The young boy Jean de Saintré succeeds in gaining the favor of the king at whose court he begins his career. And given this childhood education and favorable impression, his future as a famous knight is ensured. Readers familiar with Castiglione's Book of the Courtier will recognize many of the traits of the successful courtier. A gracefulness, gracieux, that earns the grace, grâce, the good favor of the king, a sweetness, a sort of mansuetudo, a moderation and humility that complements great diligence and physical adroitness. And Stephen Jager has written a wonderful book on the origins of these kinds of qualities. The mastery of skills such as horse riding, games of skill, dancing and gymnastic feats that highlight the movement of the body. Strength and mere force or weight are less important than agility, and his physical slightness highlights the skills he acquires that serve him well later on as a full-fledged knight. The qualities that make Jean de Saintré praiseworthy, and the vocabulary of praise or evaluation is abundant, are all relational and, in a sense, commonplace. Antoine de La Salle emphasizes the boy's good manners, his sweetness, his débonnairté, a term that is difficult to define and changes meaning with context, ranging from nobility to greatness to clemency to graciousness. These are qualities that are perceptible in his relations to others, in contrast, say, to his intelligence, his capacity to reflect on himself, his ability to paint, to learn languages, and so forth. Even his physical skills, horse riding and dancing, singing, gymnastics, are learned because he sees other boys or men doing them well, and presumably he does so in their company. Similarly, his mastery of the horse enables him to display it by riding in the following of the king, not to go off hunting by himself in the woods. His skills will facilitate a military career that allows others to admire it and through whose judgment he becomes one of the renowned knights of the kingdom. His pleasing nature is demonstrated both to women and to men. The pleasing service of women is not necessarily amorous, although as the narrative progresses, this will become the case. Just as in Castiglione's court, where women regulate the exchanges and are always addressed by the interlocutors, and just as in Mme de Lafayette's court, where service to powerful women is an essential part of the male courtier's function, Jehan de Saintré's praiseworthiness is determined by men and women. This is not superficial. A frequent modern reading of early modern fictions of the court is to contrast being with appearance. The court is all about appearances, not about what people or things are. In this reading, what persons are is somehow a stable, determinable, authentic, autonomous entity, entirely distinct from how others are, from one's relations with them, or from expectations tied to a person's status. In this modern reading, what a person is almost always stands in contrast to, indeed in conflict with, the appearances that a courtly life imposes on a person, that the person assumes in order to be successful. Hence, our sense about a lot of these novels is that a psychological novel about the court is almost of necessity tragic. I would argue that this is a misreading of the ethical culture of the early modern period and a misreading of euphorical fictional visions of the court. Jehan de Saintré's qualities are apparent ones, as we have seen. They have the effect of pleasing the king, the queen, the nobility present, and in return are praised by them. They are successful imitations of what other older, successful noblemen are able to do. This is precisely the circle of the acquisition and exercise of virtuous activity, one that derives from the Nicomachean ethics as well as, to a certain extent, from Cicero's rhetorical writings. These qualities do not falsify a core identity of Jehan de Saintré. Indeed, the novel never gives us a glimpse of what that core identity would be. His identity is defined by his activities. They allow the boy to become a praiseworthy knight, one who will be remembered as one of the best knights in France. They are a kind of excellence of the human person, a combination of moderation and accommodation to others, physical skill and physical courage, a mastery of oneself and of the horse on which one's status depends. Let me move to another fiction of the court, and this one much better known. I will not quote the famous passages evoking grace and favor, spezzatura, and so forth. Instead, let us look at the prologue to the conversations of the Book of the Courtier, during which Castiglione describes the court of Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino. The Duke himself, although endowed with all the virtues of his magnificent father Federico, Lume della Italia, was so ill-treated by fortune that he was sickly and his own military and other ventures ended in calamity. That notwithstanding, he served with great honor the kings of Naples and the Pope Alexander VI. At the latter's death, when Giulio della Rovere became Pope in 1503, Guidobaldo became commander of the pontifical armies, and despite his infirmity, he organized a splendid court in Urbino. So I will read the English this time. In this time, following his accustomed fashion, above all other things, he arranged it such that his house would be full of the noblest, valorous gentlemen, with whom he lived in great intimacy, taking pleasure in conversation with them, in which the pleasure that he gave to others was not lesser than the pleasure he received from others, since he was most learned in Latin and in Greek, and since he had, together with affability and a pleasing disposition, the knowledge of an infinite number of things. And in addition to this, so much did his magnanimity spur him on, that even though he could not with his own person practice the activities of a knight, as he had done previously, Nevertheless, he took the greatest pleasure in seeing them in others. And with his words correcting or praising everyone according to their merits, clearly demonstrating how much judgment he possessed in such things, such that in jousts, in tourneys, in ridings, in the handling of all sorts of weapons, and similarly in festivities and games and music, and some in all the activities appropriate to noble horsemen, everyone was intent on showing himself such that he would merit to be judged worthy of such a noble friendship. We do not need to spend much time on the elements that were already present in the Antoine de la Salle passage. A milieu of intense sociability and relational qualities, the exchange of pleasure, godendosi, piacere, affabilità, piacevolezza, as an activity of the highest order, and exercises of physical movement placed on the same level as festive games and music. This time, of course, the perspective is that of the prince, and not the aspiring young courtier knight, and the pursuit of these activities is seen as a product of his grandezza dell'anima, a vernacular version of the virtue of magnanimitas. Pleasure, in addition, is compatible with great learning in Latin and in Greek, and with the knowledge of an infinite number of things, but the learning is not pursued for its own sake, and does not distance him from others, but is at the service of sociability. All of this happens despite the Duke's own troubles, especially his health, and just as Jehan de Saintré's slight physical build made his chivalric exploits all the more remarkable, the Duke's infirmity is an occasion for him to display all the more effectively the greatness of his soul. The commerce, the friendly, intimate network within this court is nourished through praise and correction on the part of the prince, and by the wish to merit the praise of the prince on the part of the assembly. The prince himself is in a position to praise and to correct, given his own previously acquired habits, which he can no longer exercise freely, but which have left him with enough judgment and pleasure in seeing and in judging others. He is at the apex, as it were, of these displays of excellence, with fortune, not through any fault of his own, preventing him from actually practicing the opere della cavalleria. Once again, appearance is everything, since it is a validation of virtuous activity. The Duke is spurred on by his magnanimity to wish to see others display their skills, and his judgment, far from being enigmatic, is clearly demonstrated by his words that praise and correct. We are in a virtuous circle of appearances. I would like to insist on two literary features of this passage. The first is its relative lexical paucity, that is, the poverty of the lexicon. The vocabulary of pleasure is abundant, but not terribly varied. Similarly, the term nobile and its derivatives are ubiquitous. We also find a relatively technical vocabulary, although this is not apparent to us today. The aforementioned grandezza dell'anima, but also affabilità, esercizio, opera, and giudizio, are vernacular versions of technical vocabulary deriving from rhetoric and commentary on the Nicomachean ethics. In other words, Castiglione avoids the option of copious language while moving freely in the realm of moral philosophy and rational discourse. The second literary feature of this passage is hyperbole. The courtiers are nobilissimi. The Duke knows infinite cose and takes grandissimo piacere in seeing others display their skills. The use of hyperbole can be fastidious to us, as if the very fact of hyperbole were a weakening of the lexical content, as if it put everything in a sort of blur. That is, I would submit the judgment of a modern reader fed by realist narrative. Hyperbole is here an indication of a kind of ethical activity, as I've suggested it, the continuous display of excellence. When Castiglione says that the courtiers were nobilissimi, he does not mean that all aristocrats in all of Italy were less well-born, but that the aristocrats present in Urbino strove to exhibit excellence through their various activities. Similarly, when he says that the Duke knew an infinite number of things, he does not mean that no possible limit could be found to the number of things the Duke knew, just that the Duke exhibited an excellence of commerce with others that displayed a memory of the very many appropriate things, just like a well-versed and judicious Ciceronian orator, and that this memory was put to the use of pleasure. My third example of court fiction is no less famous. Mme de Lafayette's Princesse de Clèves begins with a long section introducing the main actors of the court in which the story takes place. And the novel concerns the final years of the reign of Henry II and the Queen Catherine of Medici and the king's mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Similarly to the Libro del Cortegiano, the introduction consists of a series of epideictic passages, any number of which could have provided us with material. Women are arguably more at the forefront than in previous court fictions, and of course the protagonist is a woman. For the sake of continuity, I will choose the passage that evokes the Vidame de Chartres and his friend, the Duc de Nemours. So I will come back again to this passage in greater detail. Jamais cour n'a eu tant de belles personnes et d'hommes admirablement bien faits. Le vidame de Chartres, descendu de cette ancienne maison de Vendôme, dont les princes du sang n'ont point dédaigné de porter le nom, était également distingué dans la guerre et dans la galanterie, et était beau de bonne mine, vaillant, hardi, libéral. Toutes ses bonnes qualités étaient vives et éclatantes. Enfin, il était seul digne d'être comparé au duc de Nemours, si quelqu'un lui eût pu être comparable. Mais ce prince était un chef-d'œuvre de la nature. Ce qu'il avait de moins admirable, c'était d'être l'homme du monde le mieux fait et le plus beau. Ce qui le mettait au-dessus des autres était une valeur incomparable et un agrément dans son esprit, dans son visage et dans ses actions que l'on n'a jamais vu qu'à lui seul. Il avait un engouement qui plaisait également aux hommes et aux femmes, une adresse extraordinaire dans tous ses exercices, une manière de s'habiller qui était toujours suivie de tout le monde sans pouvoir être imitée, et enfin un air dans toute sa personne qui faisait qu'on ne pouvait regarder que lui seul dans tous les lieux où il paraissait. Lafayette's epideictic discourse here derives from the elements of traditional discourse of courtly virtue as we've seen it practiced by Lassalle and Castiglione. The noble women and men demonstrate the continuity between the aesthetics of physical movement and the giving of pleasure by conversation, demeanor, and appearance. All of these qualities are relational. The vidame and the duke are not praised for intellectual qualities, and they are not praised for the products of their actions. For example, Nemours had un agrément dans son esprit, dans son visage et dans ses actions que l'on n'a jamais vu qu'à lui seul. Il avait un enjouement qui plaisait également aux hommes et aux femmes, une adresse extraordinaire dans tous ses exercices. Lafayette does not praise Nemours for having solved various problems of geometry or for his explanation of why Titian is superior to Lafayette. She does not praise Nemours for having contributed to winning a battle against the empire or for having told the king what troop movement would lead to his victory. The praiseworthy qualities of Nemours are a doing and an acting, not a producing or a product. I mean this in the Aristotelian sense of energeia, an activity or an operation, as opposed to a production or a product, which would be poiesis. This activity is observable and comparable to other activities done by other gentlemen at the court. Your worth is measured by the praise that the activity elicits, not by the praise that the product elicits, although it is understood that an excellent activity will result in splendid achievements. So Nemours was superior to the vidame, not because he killed more enemy noblemen, but because while he was in battle, he did it observably better than anyone else. This does not mean that Nemours' activity is somehow disjoined from its outcome, just for show, or proceeding potentially from a faint-hearted or imprudent man. The excellence of Nemours' activity is the result of much practice, just as Jehan de Saintré needed to form himself to become a magnificent knight. Nemours is un chef-d'œuvre de la nature in the sense that he's endowed with qualities he has no control over, beauty and radiant well-being. What places him above everyone else is this ability to please and to elicit admiration. His adroit physical movement, his social adeptness, and his choice of clothing are not plunked down by nature, but it is understood that they are the manifestations of dispositions that are acquired. Precisely because he has done something with his natural gifts of beauty, something that is superior to nature itself, is he to be admired above all others. This is a classic element of epideictic rhetoric, and it reflects the way virtue ethics are built into this rhetoric. Nemours' superiority is consonant with, indeed a manifestation of, his virtues of affability and fortitude. Their appraisal is possible only if observed, as if the outcome itself is not a measure of the disposition of virtue. It is a distinction parallel to rhetoric as the art of persuading, which is Cicero's definition of rhetoric, that is, the excellence of a speech will be measured to the extent that it can persuade. And rhetoric, on the other hand, is the art of speaking well, which is Quintilian's definition. Victory as such is as much an aim for Quintilian, but the outcome should not determine the quality of the activity itself. Similarly, just like fortune did not favor the sickly but supremely skillful Duke Guidobaldo, fortune can easily prevent an extremely skillful warrior from winning a combat. Indeed, one may argue only fortune prevented Nemours from marrying Mademoiselle de Chartres, the future Mme de Clèves, for had he met her at a royal ball before her marriage, their instant attraction to each other would have motivated the parties to at least envisage a marriage. There is something to Nemours, one will argue, something that transcends the activities of virtue, and that is a pre-romantic sublime, a sort of nescio quid, a je ne sais quoi, this air that he possesses that makes everyone just look at him when he appears in company. I do think that there is a latent tendency in the novel to anticipate a sense of uniqueness of the person, a sense that some qualities transcend the possibility of being shared. But I think that this is only latent, and one can argue just as cogently that this air has much to do with the sprezzatura Castiglione invokes and describes, and has very little to do with any kind of essence of the person. Nemours' air is measurable only by the reaction it provokes. Everyone is forced to look at just him, not those who surround him. His choice of clothing is impossible to imitate, and this reaction is consonant with the constant stream of hyperbole that irrigates Lafayette's court descriptions. Finally, we notice once again a kind of sameness of the descriptive vocabulary, as if the accumulation of near synonyms were an amplification faithful to the magnificence of the court. The vidame is both beau and de bonne mine. He is both vaillant and hardi. Nemours is both le plus beau et le mieux fait. Courtly epideictic seems to empty out the semantic content of predicates or make them unremarkable and emphasize instead, as I've mentioned, others' perception or evaluation of the person. It is less important that Nemours' features are regular, that he might have a large forehead and dark brown eyes, than that his beauty is deemed to be incomparable to anyone else's, and that one can see only him when he is surrounded by other men who should be comparable to him. If one saw him alone, if one encountered Nemours alone, perhaps his beauty would be less striking. It is not what he says, but the fact that what he says and how he says it pleases others. Perhaps his collected sayings in a printed book would not have the same effect. This extreme relational nature of predicates combined with their relative colorlessness reproduces, as I have suggested, the heuristic mechanism of virtue ethics, determined by praise and practiced through observation of those who are praised. We will now turn in our final passages to a portion of a long dialogue between Mme de Clèves and M de Nemours. And this is really an exchange for which the novel is extremely famous. In the 17th century as well. Her husband has died, Mme de Clèves' husband has died after believing that his wife had been unfaithful to him. One of his men saw Nemours entering into the park in which was situated a pavilion where Mme de Clèves was staying alone. Mme de Clèves is a widow now, still loves Nemours, is free to marry him, and M. de Nemours asks nothing better. She refuses and will eventually retreat from the court to a convent and spend the rest of her short life accomplishing virtuous deeds. During the dialogue, she both reveals her love for him, but also announces her unwillingness to marry him and explains why this is the case. Her decision is motivated by two kinds of reasons. First, her duty toward her dead husband not to marry the man whose behavior caused his death, even if it was on the basis of a false belief. Second, her considerations of her own repos, as she formulates it, that is, her own well-being. And I will come back to these passages again in a second. Je vous en ai trop dit pour vous cacher que vous me l'avez fait connaître, dire la jalousie, et que je souffris de si cruelles peines le soir que la reine Dauphine me donna cette lettre de Mme de Clèves, que l'on disait qui s'adressait à vous, qui m'en est demeuré une idée qui me fait croire que c'est le plus grand de tous les maux. Par vanité ou par goût, toutes les femmes souhaitent vous attacher. Il y en a peu à qui vous ne plaisiez. Mon expérience me ferait croire qu'il n'y en a point à qui vous ne puissiez plaire. Je vous croirais toujours amoureux et aimé, et je ne me tromperai pas souvent. Dans cet état, néanmoins, je n'aurais d'autre parti à prendre que celui de la souffrance. Je ne sais même si j'oserais me plaindre. On fait des reproches à un amant, mais on fait à un mari quand on n'a qu'à lui reprocher de n'avoir plus d'amour. Quand je pourrais m'accoutumer à cette sorte de malheur, pourrais-je m'accoutumer à celui de croire toujours, M. de Clèves vous accuser de sa mort, me reprocher de vous avoir aimé, de vous avoir épousé, et me faire sentir la différence de son attachement au vôtre. Il est impossible, continua-t-elle, de passer par-dessus des raisons si fortes. Mme de Clèves then summarizes her motivations a few moments later. Ce que je crois devoir à la mémoire de M. de Clèves serait faible s'il n'était soutenu par l'intérêt de mon repos, et les raisons de mon repos ont besoin d'être soutenues de celles de mon devoir. One has traditionally interpreted these explanations through the filter of a Jansenist critique of worldliness, a retreat from the agitation of the court being the only way to realize spiritual peace. One can also interpret this as an Augustinian condemnation of desire. Only a suppression of the sources of desire can open the human being to God, and only an entire reorientation of the will can accomplish that, hence the extreme difficulty of the task. I would submit, however, that the Princesse de Clèves is here putting into practice one of the cardinal Aristotelian virtues, namely the virtue of prudence. The central question is, should I marry Nemours? This is then a deliberative question. What is the best conduct to follow in order to realize the future most conducive to my well-being? The future is submitted to contingency, to things that could be the case or not the case. Ever since the Ciceronian revision of prudence in the De Officiis, this virtue has been laid out in three stages or components. First, the use of memory to gather information from one's own past experience and that of others, relevant to understand the present circumstance and the range of future contingencies. Second, a keen perception of the present situation of where things stand now. And third, a kind of foreseeing of future circumstances to allow choice among them. And so let us retrace these steps in the justifications of the Princess. So first, a false belief that Nemours had been unfaithful to her gives her knowledge of the suffering caused by jealousy. Jealousy is thus an evil to be avoided. Recalling a past event provides this knowledge. And vous me l'avez fait connaître, la jalousie, c'est le plus grand de tous les maux. Then, second, her current perception of the attractiveness of Nemours to women and his sensitivity to their reaction leads her to believe that this false belief can easily be a true one. Her intelligence provides her with this insight. Par vanité ou par goût, toutes les femmes souhaitent de vous attacher. She realizes that through her intelligence. Il y en a peu à qui vous ne plaisiez, mon expérience me ferait croire qu'il n'y en a pas un point à qui vous ne puissiez plaire. Third, her foreseeing of the future contingency of a true belief that Nemours is unfaithful to her would cause her immense suffering. Je vous croirais toujours amoureux et aimé, je ne me tromperai pas souvent. Dans cet état néanmoins, je n'aurais d'autre parti à prendre que celui de la souffrance. It might be the case, however, that the belief in his unfaithfulness would be a false one, and she could be convinced of that, but it is improbable, since only M. de Clèves, perhaps, was a man capable of preserving his love and marriage. So the scenario that Nemours might be unfaithful to her and that she would suffer miserably is in fact the more probable one. By choosing then not to marry Nemours and to distance herself from him, she is making the most prudent choice given her aim of personal well-being. A person indifferent to suffering might choose otherwise. One can also look at her justifications following the scholastic theme of concilium, judicium, praeceptum, that is reflection, judgment, and application of a decision. In which case, we are still lacking the application of a prudential conclusion, the choice of remaining unmarried. How can she apply her reasoning? She might figure it out, but how can she apply what she has reasoned? For this, as we have seen, she needs help, which comes in the form of her duty to M de Clèves and a kind of inner image of him reproaching her for marrying the man responsible for his death. Pourrais-je m'accoutumer à celui de croire voir toujours M de Clèves vous accuser de sa mort? This sort of spiritual exercise, the conjuring of her dead husband, would prevent her from becoming numb to her suffering, but has the immediate effect of allowing her prudential reasons to be transformed into action. The devoir that facilitates the transition to action, the imperium or praeceptum in scholastic terms, is not a duty in the Kantian or modern sense. It is not a general duty that applies universally to particulars. For example, act as if your action could always be universalized. It is the imagining of her husband present, accusing Nemours of causing his death. In other words, it is more of an obligation to someone in particular, to someone's memory, a devoir in the early modern sense of an habitual or customary act that reflects an attachment to a person. The princess is not saying, I am doing something that everyone should do, and because everyone should do it, I will too. But that for the sake of her well-being, she is choosing not to have the image of the Prince de Clèves haunt her future. That being said, the fulfilling of this obligation is eminently praiseworthy, as the conclusion of the novel suggests. So the princess has transmitted a complete account of prudential reasoning while conveying the means of this reasoning to become action to be executed. She has performed a feat of Aristotelian virtue. When the novel ends on the note, sa vie laissa des exemples de vertu inimitables, this is a confirmation of her virtue, a hyperbolic praise of her prudence. This praise does not remove her life from all human practice. The praise means that, as in other instances of the novel, she has achieved an excellence, a kind of summit that she has given us a complete account of. Now, this is important, the giving account of something. She has acted in a completely self-aware and lucid way and has expressed that to the person most concerned by her decision and by her application of the decision. This is an extraordinary combination of the practice of virtue and its discursive expression. It elicits and provides material for extraordinary praise. This virtue is only perceptible through her speech, through her activity toward her lover. It is not coming to realize who she really is, but demonstrating her prudential reasoning and applying it to an actual decision and manifesting this to another. So I'm almost out of time, and I would like to present you with just one passage that will be the absolute opposite of everything that I have said in the last 35 minutes or so. And that's because I think it's contrastive readings are often the best way to see the pertinence, the relevance of what one does in the early ones. So I'm not going to do any kind of justice to the philosophical backgrounds of Camus' writings, and I will just speak about this one passage at the end of a novella. So La Femme adultère is the first of a series of novellas published together in 1957 under the title of L'Exil et le Royaume. The protagonist, the wife of a traveling merchant named Janine, accompanies her husband Marcel as he visits Algerian towns and attempts to sell his cloth by showing local Arab merchants samples. She is lonely and alienated by the cold and hostile environment, both human and natural, until she is able to see the landscape once she goes up there with her husband for the first time from a terraced promontory and senses the vastness and the freedom that this perspective on the Algerian landscape offers. During the night, During the night, when Marcel has fallen asleep in the hotel room, she leaves the room and the hotel to return to the terrace, which she had visited during the day with her husband. The night is splendid and the gyrating stars begin to affect her deeply, in an overtly sensual way, in fact. Devant elle, les étoiles tombaient, une à une, puis s'éteignaient parmi les pierres du désert, et à chaque fois, Janine s'ouvrait un peu plus à la nuit. Elle respirait, elle oubliait le froid, le poids des êtres, la vie démente ou figée, la longue angoisse de vivre et de mourir. Après tant d'années où, fuyant devant la peur, elle avait follement couru son but, elle s'arrêtait enfin. En même temps, il lui semblait retrouver ses racines, la sève montait à nouveau dans son corps qui ne tremblait plus. Janine's experience is one of self-realization, a sense that she is retrieving an authentic being that is herself, that allows her to regain energy. This experience is not an activity in the Aristotelian sense, and it is solitary, not witnessed by anyone or done in order to affect anyone else. It is neutral, neither to be praised nor to be blamed, something that involves no reasoning or choice, or at the very least, the fiction does not represent the coming to a choice as relevant. Her self-realization is more of a passion in the technical sense of something overcoming her, affecting her, that might allow a greater self-knowledge or self-mastery in the future. This sort of sensory space is difficult to find in any early modern representations. Janine's experience of stopping and finding her roots is deprived of any concourse of rationality that would make it an act of prudence. In addition, it is deprived of the praeceptum of the application that constitutes its execution. And I will just leave you with the final paragraph. In fact, if you look at the very end, and I realize that some of the images of the participants, in fact, are blocking some of the text. So, elle pleurait de toutes ses larmes, sans pouvoir se retenir. Ce n'est rien, mon chéri, disait-elle, ce n'est rien. So she is, I would submit, the exact opposite of the Princesse de Clèves. So I will stop at this point, and I look very much forward to discussions and questions during the period of discussion. Thank you very much.